October 1939. Europe was at war, and the United States Army was still trying to turn a new rifle into something it could trust by the millions. Then the Army did something that looked almost reckless. It formally recommended changing the gas system on the M1 rifle it had already adopted. Tens of thousands of the early rifles would exist before the transition was finished. Springfield Armory had already spent years developing the design. Production was still painfully slow. Every month mattered. And yet the Army chose to rework the weapon anyway. 3 years later, on Guadalcanal, American soldiers would carry the corrected version into a kind of fighting no proving ground in Massachusetts could reproduce. That connection is the real story of the M1 Garand. The rifle is remembered for 8 rounds, for semi-automatic fire, for the metallic ping of an empty clip leaving the receiver. But its history turns on 2 very different alleged mistakes. One was mechanical, documented, and serious enough to change the rifle before the United States entered the war. The other became one of the most famous battlefield legends of the 20th century. The Army treated them differently because only one of them was actually breaking the weapon. John Cantius Garand began nowhere near an armory. He was born in Quebec in 1888, one of 12 children. After his mother died, his father moved the family to Connecticut, where the children went to work in a textile mill. Garand learned English while working. His formal schooling ended early. What replaced school was machinery. Near the family's home, rifles used by a local shooting club sometimes became available to him between matches. Garand learned to shoot as he learned machines, by repetition, observation, and correction. In 1909, he apprenticed at Brown & Sharp in Providence, one of the great American machine tool firms. At night he took correspondence courses in engineering. That combination mattered. Garand was not simply imagining mechanisms. He understood what a cutter could make, what a tolerance meant on a drawing and on a shop floor, what happened when surfaces wore, and how a part that looked elegant in one example could become expensive or fragile when multiplied by the thousand. In 1917, when the War Department invited designs for a light machine gun, Garand submitted one. The government bought the design, and although it did not become the weapon that made his name, it brought him into the small community of engineers trying to solve automatic weapon problems for the Army. He became a machinist, took engineering courses by correspondence, and developed the kind of practical mechanical judgment that comes from making metal parts work in the real world instead of only on paper. He also became a serious rifleman. By the First World War, Garand was good enough at design that the United States government bought one of his light machine gun concepts. In November 1919, he reported to Springfield Armory as a consulting engineer. His assignment was easy to describe and extraordinarily difficult to complete. Build a self-loading infantry rifle powerful enough to replace the bolt-action Springfield Model 1903. The service cartridge was the 30-6. It was powerful, reliable, and punishing to mechanical experiments that were not ready for it. A successful rifle had to feed, fire, extract, reload itself, survive field abuse, and remain simple enough to manufacture in numbers large enough for an army. Garand spent years working through one problem after another. By the mid-1930s, the design had matured far enough for the Army to act. On January 9, 1936, the United States standardized the U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1. It was a remarkable decision. The Army was making a semi-automatic rifle its standard infantry arm at a time when bolt-action rifles still dominated the armies of the world. But adopting a design and proving it under mass use are not the same thing. Production began slowly at Springfield Armory in 1937. The first rifles were not the Garands most people recognize today. At the muzzle sat a system often called the gas trap. The principle was clever. After the bullet left the barrel, propellant gas was captured near the muzzle and redirected into a cylinder. That gas moved a piston and operating system that cycled the action for the next shot. On a test bench, the idea could work. In service, the front end introduced problems the Army could not ignore forever. The gas cylinder hardware could loosen. Alignment could suffer. Carbon fouling accumulated in a place that was awkward to clean. The bayonet mounting arrangement was less rigid than infantrymen wanted, and in rare, severe cases, a shifted front assembly could put metal where a bullet leaving the muzzle was never supposed to encounter it. The rifle was not disintegrating in every soldier's hands. Most early M1s could fire many rounds without a dramatic failure. That was exactly what made the decision difficult. This was not a spectacular defect that made every rifle useless. It was a collection of weaknesses that became more dangerous when multiplied across thousands of weapons. Thousands of soldiers and the dirt, neglect, heat, rain, and hard handling of military service. Carbon was a particularly revealing problem. A rifle can be accurate and powerful, but if ordinary soldiers and armorers cannot clean the places that collect residue, reliability becomes a maintenance problem rather than a drawing board problem. The early muzzle system put fouling where normal cleaning methods were awkward. Over time, hardened deposits could turn routine care into a repair shop job. The bayonet mount exposed another kind of weakness. A bayonet does not care whether a gas system looks elegant. It puts leverage into the front of the rifle. Infantrymen wanted the blade locked to something that felt like part of the barrel, not to a complicated assembly that could move or loosen. These details sound small beside battles and casualty lists. In peacetime development, however, small repeated defects are exactly what an army is supposed to notice. The danger was not that every gas trap M1 would suddenly fail. The danger was that the army would normalize the workarounds, teach soldiers to live with them, and then discover under wartime load that a manageable annoyance had become a fleet-wide burden. By 1939, ordnance officers in Garand were already working on the answer. The new approach was simpler. Instead of trapping gas beyond the muzzle in a separate front assembly, the redesigned rifle used a small gas port in the barrel near the muzzle. Gas was tapped directly from the barrel and sent into the operating system. That eliminated much of the troublesome hardware at the muzzle. It simplified the front end, made cleaning easier, reduced the alignment problem, and allowed a stronger bayonet mounting arrangement. On March 8, 1939, Major Guy H. Drury of the Ordnance Department wrote to Fort Benning about the redesigned system and the testing behind it. Drury's correspondence described a 10,000-round test with very good functioning, followed by additional changes aimed at simplifying production. More test rifles followed. Then, on October 26, 1939, the Ordnance Committee formally recommended replacing the gas trap arrangement. War had begun in Europe less than 2 months earlier. The timing matters. The United States did not have a surplus of time, factories, or finished rifles. The M1 was still being produced in small numbers. Every major change meant new drawings, new tooling, revised parts, inspections, retraining, and a period in which old and new components had to be managed at the same time. The easy institutional answer would have been to call the defect acceptable and keep building. Instead, the Army chose a more complicated path. It kept production moving at a limited rate while Springfield retooled around the improved front end. The new drawings were finalized in early 1940. Redesigned components began moving into production that summer. By August, the last gas trim ones had left the Springfield line. The figure cited for the gas trap production run is a little over 48,000 rifles. Most were later brought back through depots and reworked with the new system. That number is important, but not because 48,000 rifles were all worthless. They were not. The number matters because it measures how much hardware the Army was willing to revisit after admitting the design could be better. A recall at that scale was not a matter of changing a line on a blueprint. Rifles had to be identified, moved through depots, disassembled, fitted with new components, inspected, and returned to service. Factories had to make the corrected parts while also preparing for higher output. Drawings had to match tooling. Gauges had to match drawings. Workers had to learn the revised operations, and all of it happened under a strategic clock that was getting louder every month. Germany had invaded Poland. France would fall in 1940. Britain would remain at war. Japan was already fighting in China and expanding its position in Asia. The United States was not yet a belligerent, but no serious planner could assume the country had unlimited time. That pressure is what makes the redesign meaningful. The Army did not correct the M1 because there was nothing else to do. It corrected it while preparing for the possibility that it would soon need far more rifles than Springfield had ever produced. And once the redesign was established, production stopped looking experimental. By January 1941, Springfield was reportedly completing about 600 rifles a day. During the war, Springfield and Winchester together would build more than 4 million M1 rifles. The rifle that went to war in those numbers was not the rifle first standardized in 1936. It was the corrected version. That distinction would matter first not in a factory, but in the mud. There had already been hints that the rifle could deliver what its advocates promised. In August 1942, during the Marine Raider attack on Makin Island, American raiders carried a mix of weapons that included Garands. Japanese counterattacks were met by Garands, Thompson submachine guns, Browning automatic rifles, and other weapons working together. The important point is not to credit one rifle with stopping a charge. It is that semi-automatic rifles were already appearing in Pacific fighting, before they became common across the Marine Corps. and they were being judged alongside the automatic weapons and close-range fire that actually made up a defensive system. Guadalcanal would provide a much larger and harsher test. The United States Marine Corps had reasons to be skeptical of the new rifle. The Marines had conducted their own tests before the war. Their concern was not abstract conservatism. Amphibious warfare meant saltwater, sand, mud, coral dust, rough handling, and long periods with little chance to clean a weapon properly. A bolt-action Springfield was mechanically simple and familiar. If fouling made the action stiff, a Marine could still work the bolt by hand. The M1 depended on a semi-automatic operating system with tighter relationships between moving parts. In severe mud tests, the Marine evaluation raised serious questions about whether that system could be trusted under the worst field conditions. The Corps was not evaluating the Garand in isolation. Other semi-automatic designs, including the Johnson rifle and experimental competitors, were part of the broader argument over what Marines should carry ashore. Every option had trade-offs. The Garand offered standardized Army ammunition and impressive firepower, but the Marines cared about what happened after a weapon had been wet, dropped, fouled, and handled by a tired rifleman far from an armorer. That caution helps explain why the later change in attitude mattered. The Marines did not fall in love with the M1 because a brochure told them to. They had reasons to distrust it. And some of those reasons came from tests conducted before the gas-port version had accumulated the kind of combat record it would later earn. So when the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, many Marines still carried the Model 1903 Springfield. They had already been fighting for weeks when the Army began arriving in larger numbers. Guadalcanal had become a test that nobody had designed on purpose. The Marines had seized the unfinished airfield and renamed it Henderson Field. Then came the Japanese attempts to take it back. The defenders fought in heat, rain, mud, jungle, and exhaustion. Malaria spread through the ranks. Supplies were uncertain. Weapons were kept alive by men who had no laboratory benches and no controlled test conditions. On October 13, 1942, the 164th Infantry Regiment of the American Division came ashore. The regiment had roots in the North Dakota National Guard, and its soldiers carried M1 Garands. For Marines who had heard warnings about the semi-automatic rifle, the sight was almost an argument made of steel and walnut. The new weapon offered 8 rounds in an en-bloc clip. After each shot, the action loaded the next cartridge automatically. The rifleman did not have to lift, pull, push, and lock a bolt between aimed shots. That did not turn every soldier into a machine gunner. It did something more practical. It reduced the time and movement required between rifle shots. In close defensive fighting, that difference could accumulate very quickly across a squad, a platoon, and a line of foxholes. One of the most useful observers of the M1 in Pacific combat was Army officer John B. George. Before the war, George had been an accomplished long-range competitive marksman. That background gave him a different way of writing about combat. He was interested in what a weapon actually allowed a shooter to do, not only in its official specifications. He later served with Merrill's Marauders in Burma, and in 1947 he published Shots Fired in Anger, a memoir and technical account that has remained valuable because he compared weapons from the perspective of someone who understood shooting before he experienced war. George had been a competitive rifleman before the war. He approached weapons with the eye of a marksman, and after the war he published his observations in Shots Fired in Anger. He praised the M1 in unusually strong terms, but the most revealing part of his account was not the praise. It was what happened when skeptical Marines began using the rifle themselves. According to George's account, Marines who gained access to Garands took them into jungle conditions and discovered that the feared collapse in reliability did not occur the way many had expected. They noticed the extra ammunition in the rifle. They noticed the faster follow-up shot. They noticed that the operating system, when properly maintained, could survive the environment well enough to be worth the advantage it gave them. Then demand became informal. Accounts from Guadalcanal describe Marines trying very hard to get their hands on Army Garands. Stories circulated of rifles disappearing when soldiers set them down. The demand reportedly became serious enough that departing Marines were checked for Army rifles when units rotated off the island. Whether every theft story grew in the retelling is less important than what the episode reveals. A weapon that had entered the campaign under suspicion was earning trust from the people most exposed to its weaknesses. That is a very different kind of proof from a factory test. And within days of the 164th Infantry's arrival, the proof became more violent. Late in October, Japanese forces launched their major effort against the Henderson Field perimeter. The battle for Henderson Field was not decided by one rifle. American defenses included Marines and Army infantry, machine guns, automatic rifles, artillery, mortars, barbed wire, field positions, leadership, and the enormous advantage of defenders who could concentrate fire into expected avenues of attack. But the Garand changed one important part of that system. It increased what each rifleman could contribute between pauses. With a bolt-action Springfield, a trained rifleman could fire quickly, but every shot still required a physical cycle of the bolt. The firing hand or shooting position had to move, the action had to unlock and travel, the empty case had to be extracted and ejected, a new cartridge had to be chambered, and the bolt had to lock again before the next shot. With the M1, the rifle performed that cycle using energy from the fired cartridge. The shooter still had to aim, he still had to control recoil, he still had to choose when to fire, but the mechanical interruption between shots was shorter and demanded less movement. That distinction becomes important when several men are firing at moving targets in darkness or jungle. No single rifleman needs an unbelievable rate of fire. The advantage comes from many ordinary riflemen each recovering a little time between shots. Add those seconds across a squad and the line can produce a noticeably denser pattern of aimed fire. Japanese infantry doctrine had been shaped in wars where bolt-action rifles were common. A mass assault could exploit shock, darkness, confusion, and the pauses created when defenders had to work bolts and reload. That logic was not insanity. Earlier Japanese campaigns had shown that aggressive infantry attacks could break opponents whose defensive fire collapsed under shock or whose positions were not supported by enough automatic weapons and artillery. A bayonet charge across a short distance was terrifying precisely because a defender had only a limited number of chances to stop the men closing on him. But doctrine always contains assumptions about the enemy. If those assumptions are wrong, a tactic can become far more expensive than its designers expected. The M1 did not eliminate the need for machine guns or artillery, but it changed the baseline firepower of the ordinary American rifleman. That made the pauses an attacker hoped to exploit less predictable. Against Garand-equipped riflemen, one of those pauses became shorter. The defender fired, the action cycled, the rifle was ready again. Some accounts from the fighting describe Japanese attackers interpreting the density of American fire as machine gun fire. That should not be taken to mean the Garand replaced machine guns, or that Japanese officers had a single, precise misunderstanding about every American position. It means the semi-automatic rifle helped change the texture of defensive fire at the individual soldier level. The 164th Infantry fought beside Marine units during the battle. The Japanese assaults were broken at terrible cost. The airfield remained in American hands. The 164th's role also changed Marine opinion in a way that paperwork could not. Marines had already fought desperate actions with the Springfield. Now they were watching Army riflemen deliver repeated semi-automatic fire from neighboring positions with a weapon the Corps had once judged cautiously. The comparison was happening under combat conditions, not at a demonstration range. That experience did not instantly erase every concern, but the direction of travel was clear. As the war continued, the Marine Corps adopted the M1 more broadly. From later Pacific campaigns onward, Garands became normal Marine weapons rather than suspicious Army novelties. For the M1, Guadalcanal mattered because the rifle had now passed through the exact environment its skeptics feared: salt, mud, rain, jungle, exhausted maintenance, and close combat. The redesigned system had survived not as a perfect machine, but as a useful one. And useful is the standard that matters in war. A rifle does not need to be flawless. It needs to fail less often than the problem it is solving. The early gas trap arrangement had threatened that balance. The gas port redesign improved it before the United States entered the war. That was the first mistake. The second one was almost the opposite. It was a flaw that became famous because people could hear it. The M1 fed from an 8-round en bloc clip. The clip was pressed into the open receiver with the cartridges already held together. When the 8th round was fired, the rifle ejected the empty clip automatically. The piece of steel left the receiver with a clear metallic sound, the ping. On a quiet firing range, it is unmistakable. In movies, it is perfect. The rifle fires, the clip jumps free. The sound tells the audience that the weapon is empty. From that simple fact grew one of the most persistent legends about the Garand. The story says enemy soldiers learned to listen for the ping. The moment they heard it, they knew the American rifle was empty. They could rise from cover, rush the position, and attack before the rifleman reloaded. It is a frightening idea because it turns the M1's most distinctive feature into a built-in warning for the enemy. It is also a story that becomes less convincing when placed inside the conditions of a real firefight. Start with sound. A clip makes a sharp noise on a range because the range becomes quiet after a shot. A battlefield does not. Rifle cracks overlap with automatic weapons. Shouted orders impacts grenades, mortars, and artillery. Sound reflects through jungle, buildings, ridges, and tree lines. Several men may be firing at once. Even if an enemy soldier heard a metallic ping, he would have to identify it correctly, locate the rifleman who produced it, know that the sound represented an empty Garand rather than loose equipment or some other metal impact, and act before the American finished reloading. Then there is the squad. Infantrymen do not normally fight as isolated duelists standing 20 feet apart and waiting for one another to finish a magazine. A rifleman has men around him. Those men have rifles, automatic weapons, and their own fields of fire. A momentary empty rifle does not create a momentarily empty defensive position. And then there is the documentary problem. The legend is famous, but no formal Japanese training doctrine built around listening for Garand clips is established in the account behind this story. That does not mean no soldier ever noticed the sound, feared it, or tried to exploit it. Battlefields are full of local habits that never become official doctrine. It means the legend should not be promoted into a universal tactical fact without stronger evidence. The Army's behavior is revealing here. There was no wartime redesign campaign comparable to the gas system correction whose purpose was to silence the clip. The ping remained. That is not proof that nobody ever worried about it. It is evidence that the institution treated it very differently from the gas trap problem. The gas trap weakness produced mechanical concerns that engineers could reproduce, inspect, test, and redesign. The ping produced anxiety and stories. One problem changed the rifle. The other changed the folklore around the rifle. That distinction became more important as the war expanded. By 1943 and 1944, Garands were no longer unusual equipment arriving on a contested island. They were a normal part of American infantry power. The effect was not that old forms of attack became harmless. By this stage of the war, American units also had more than rifles. Defensive positions were built around overlapping weapons. Browning automatic rifles added mobile automatic fire within squads. Belt-fed machine guns covered approaches. Mortars and artillery reached assembly areas and routes of advance. Engineers wire mines, field fortifications, ammunition supply, and communications all affected whether a line could absorb a mass attack. The Garand belonged inside that combined picture. Its importance was that the ordinary rifleman no longer represented the slowest part of the small arms system to the same degree. The baseline weapon in his hands could fire a rapid second or third aimed shot without a manual bolt cycle. Nothing about a semi-automatic rifle made a mass infantry assault safe to face. The clearest reminder came on Saipan. On July 7, 1944, with the Japanese defense collapsing, thousands of Japanese troops and others caught in the final position moved into what became the largest final mass assault of the battle. Estimates cited for the assault put the attacking force at roughly 4,300. They struck American Army positions, including the 105th Infantry Regiment. The fighting lasted for hours. American casualties were severe. The 105th Infantry suffered close to 1,000 killed or wounded in the figures used here. Whatever the final accounting, the scale makes the point unmistakable. Semi-automatic rifles did not make determined mass attacks easy to stop. Positions were overrun. Crews were forced back. Fighting reached terrifyingly close range. The defenders survived because the whole defensive system kept functioning long enough to absorb the assault and rebuild a line, not because any single weapon created an invisible wall. That matters because it corrects the easiest myth to create around the Garand. The rifle did not make the Banzai charge obsolete by itself. The defenders still needed machine guns, Browning automatic rifles, artillery, ammunition, depth, leadership, and men willing to hold positions under horrifying pressure. The Garand's contribution was narrower and more believable. It allowed ordinary riflemen to put aimed follow-up shots downrange without manually cycling a bolt after every round. Across many riflemen, that increased the density and continuity of defensive fire. It did not erase danger, it helped defenders answer it. That difference is important because weapons history is easily distorted by superlatives. A weapon gets called revolutionary, decisive, unstoppable, or war-winning. Then the machine replaces the people, the logistics, and the institutions that made it useful. The M1's real story is stronger without that exaggeration. Garand designed the rifle, but the rifle that fought the war was the product of an entire system around him. Engineers, machinists, inspectors, test boards, armorers, depot workers, soldiers, marines, and an ordnance department willing to revise something it had already approved. The design survived because criticism was allowed to become hardware. That is also why the story should not be reduced to Garand alone. He was the central designer, but he did not personally manufacture 4 million rifles, run every test, inspect every depot conversion, or maintain the weapons in the Pacific. The people who machined receivers, heat-treated parts, gauged tolerances, assembled clips, packed rifles, repaired damaged weapons, and trained replacements formed the industrial half of the combat system. Wartime output transformed Springfield Armory. Springfield's output reportedly reached roughly 122,000 rifles in January 1944, thousands per day at the peak. Women made up a major share of the wartime workforce. Winchester ran a parallel production line in Connecticut. Those numbers are not merely industrial trivia. A semi-automatic service rifle has strategic value only if an army can standardize it, feed it ammunition, supply spare parts, train armorers, and put enough examples into units that its advantages are not confined to a few specialists. The gasport redesign made that scale easier to sustain because the front end was simpler and more serviceable than the arrangement it replaced. And once the corrected rifle reached combat criticism continued. The Marines who had distrusted it tested it against their own experience. Riflemen learned where it needed cleaning, where it could be trusted, and how its 8-round clip changed their rhythm of fire. The weapon entered service not as a finished legend, but as an evolving industrial object. That is why the timeline before Pearl Harbor matters so much. The United States did not wait until Guadalcanal to discover the front end was troublesome. It did not wait until American soldiers were deep in a Pacific campaign to begin redesigning the gas system. The key work was already underway in 1939. By March 1940, the revised drawings were being finalized. By that summer, the new components were entering production. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, the Gasport M1 was already the standard production form. The correction had moved from letter, to drawing, to test, to tooling, to rifle. That sequence is less cinematic than a firefight. It may also be the most consequential part of the story. Military equipment usually fails in layers. A defect appears in testing. A maintainer complains. A soldier works around it. An engineer proposes a change. A committee decides whether the change is worth the delay. A factory determines whether it can actually build the new part. A depot decides what to do with the old part. A unit in the field finally discovers whether the solution survives mud and fatigue. The M1 passed through every one of those layers before its reputation hardened into legend. The famous battlefield praise came later. On January 26, 1945, Lieutenant General George S. Patton wrote to Major General Levin H. Campbell, the Chief of Ordnance. Patton's description became one of the best-known sentences ever written about an American weapon. He called the M1 rifle, in his opinion, the greatest battle implement ever devised. That quotation is often treated as the climax of the Garand story. But praise in 1945 is less interesting without the embarrassment of 1939. Patton was praising the rifle after years of redesign, production learning, depot rework, field maintenance, and combat use. He was not praising a first draft. He was praising what survived correction. John Garand himself never became rich from the millions of rifles that carried his name. As a government employee, his work belonged to the United States. A later bill proposed a large congressional payment to him, but it did not pass. He continued at Springfield Armory until his retirement in 1953, more than 3 decades after he first walked through the gates. He died in 1974. By then the rifle had served through a world war in Korea, passed into reserve use, competition, collecting, and American memory. And memory simplified it. The child from a textile mill became the lone inventor. The Garand became the rifle that stopped charges. The ping became a deadly giveaway. The complicated system of testing, correction, manufacturing, maintenance, and collective combat disappeared behind a few clean images. But the less tidy version explains more. The first M1 was not the final M1. The gas trap was a real engineering weakness, but it was discovered early enough to be confronted before wartime production reached full scale. The Marine Corps' skepticism was not foolish, because mud and amphibious conditions were legitimate threats to a semi-automatic mechanism. Guadalcanal did not prove the Garand could never fail. It proved that the corrected rifle could offer enough reliability, enough firepower, and enough practical advantage that skeptical combat troops wanted it for themselves. The ping was real too, but a real sound is not automatically a real tactical defect, and the absence of a second redesign campaign tells its own story. One concern had measurable mechanical consequences. The other lived mostly in fear, memory, and later storytelling. The M1 Garand was not remarkable because nobody got it wrong. By the time an empty clip rang on a Pacific battlefield, the more important decision had already been made years earlier, in offices, test ranges, and machine shops far from the shooting. Fix the failure that could be proven, and do it before soldiers had to pay for it.